The woman who tried to have my grandfather's cabin condemned was standing on her deck with binoculars when the county inspector apologized to me. She smiled like she had just won something. And I remember thinking that people only smile that way when they know something you do not. What Lenora Vale did not know was that, before sunset, I would make one phone call that would place 11 homes in her precious neighborhood on land my family had owned for more than a century. My name is Elias Mercer. I am 63 years old, and I spent 34 years working as a field forester for the state of Maine, which means I have walked more property lines than most people have walked grocery store aisles. My wife, June, says I can spot a dying spruce from half a mile away but cannot find the mustard when it is directly in front of me, and she is not entirely wrong. We have been married 39 years when we moved into my grandfather's old cabin full-time, 18 months after we both retired. The cabin sat on a granite shelf above Alder Run, surrounded by black spruce, red maple, and enough mosquitoes in July to carry off a small dog. My grandfather, Hollis Mercer, built it in 1951 after coming home from Korea with a damaged shoulder, a silver star he kept in a cigar box, and no interest in talking about either one. He cut the logs himself, fitted every corner with an axe, and told my father that a house built slowly would teach the people inside it how to live the same way. 73 years later, those walls were still standing, the roof had been replaced twice, the floors refinished, and the chimney rebuilt after a lightning strike in 1987, but the original cedar logs had not moved an inch. Lenora called the cabin an illegal wilderness structure. She also claimed our septic system was unpermitted, our woodshed was unsafe, and our smoke from the chimney was creating what she called a visual nuisance for residents of Cedar Hollow Ridge. That was the neighborhood her developer friends had built north of our land. 52 expensive homes with matching mailboxes, decorative stone entrances, and rules about everything from porch furniture to the acceptable height of tomato plants. Lenora had been president of the Cedar Hollow Ridge Homeowners Association for 13 years. Her husband, Everett Vale, owned North Star Title and Escrow in Presque Isle, the same company that had handled the sale of the northern portion of my family's land back in 2004. At the time, I did not think that detail mattered. Later, it became the only detail that mattered. The county inspector arrived at 10:20 on a cold Tuesday morning in late September. His name was Darrell Knox, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair, a paper coffee cup, and the patient expression of somebody who had spent 2 decades explaining basic facts to angry property owners. He knew me from my forestry days and gave me a look before he even stepped out of the truck. "Elias," he said, "I am going to guess you have paperwork." I told him I had more paperwork than furniture. June brought coffee while I spread the permits across the kitchen table. The original 1951 building approval, septic records from 1984 and 2007, chimney inspection certificates, renovation permits, and a county exemption for the little sauna I had built the year before. Darrell walked the property, took photographs, checked the distances with a handheld GPS, and spent 40 minutes trying to find something wrong. He found nothing. When he finished, he wrote that the complaint was unsupported and the property was fully compliant with all applicable codes. Then he looked through the kitchen window toward the ridge, where Lenora's white house sat above the trees. "Elias," he said quietly, "this is the 5th complaint she has filed against people who are not members of her HOA. Every one of them has been dismissed." I asked him what he thought she wanted. He shrugged, but not casually. "I do not know," he said, "though I have noticed she only complains about properties touching the southern edge of that development." Then he folded his copy of the report, put on his cap, and added, "Start keeping everything. Dates, photographs, calls, letters, all of it." June closed the door after he left and stood there with her hand on the knob. She had taught chemistry for 31 years and could recognize a dangerous reaction before the rest of us smelled smoke. She said, "That woman is not bothered by the cabin." I knew she was right. Lenora could barely see the cabin from her house, and smoke from our chimney drifted east, away from the neighborhood. The complaint was pressure, nothing more. The question was pressure toward what? I sat at the kitchen table, stared at the county report, and thought about the land. Our parcel covered 164 acres, mostly timber, with nearly 3/4 of a mile along Alder Run. It had once been part of a 300-acre homestead granted to my great-grandfather, Silas Mercer, in 1901. Silas marked the southwest corner with a granite witness stone carved SM 1901. then set smaller stones along the northern line. I had not walked that boundary in almost 20 years. My father had sold the northern 136 acres to a developer in 2004 after my mother got sick. The developer built Cedar Hollow Ridge, and Everett Vale's title company ensured the transaction. I picked up the phone and called Owen Pike. Owen was 70 years old, a retired licensed land surveyor who had worked with the State Conservation Department and had once spent 3 days with me locating an old timber easement through a swamp where the Blackflies had nearly achieved organized government. He answered on the second ring. "Elias," he said, "either you need a boundary walked or a body buried." I told him I was hoping for the boundary. He came the next morning at 7 with an old gray pickup, a total station in a wooden case, 2 GPS receivers, and a breakfast sandwich June had not yet offered but had apparently expected him to want. We started at the western corner and followed the old deed description through wet ground, fallen fir, and a strip of young spruce planted after a 1998 cut. 46 minutes later, Owen stopped beside a granite stone buried under moss and leaf litter. He cleared it with his glove until the carving appeared. SM 1901. He stared at the stone, then looked uphill toward the HOA's black metal perimeter fence. "Elias," he said, "where do you think their boundary is?" I pointed at the fence. Owen shook his head slowly. "That fence is not even close." He set up his equipment, checked the recorded bearings twice, then walked another 300 yards through the trees. When he came back, his face had changed. The easy humor was gone. He opened the development plat on his tablet, overlaid it with the original homestead description, and let out a breath through his teeth. "Elias, the neighborhood line is 227 feet south of where it legally belongs." I asked him how many homes were affected. He zoomed in, counted once, then counted again. 11 for certain, he said, and possibly a 12th garage. Their yards, septic fields, retaining walls, some of the houses themselves, all of it is sitting on your parcel. I looked at the stone my great-grandfather had carved 123 years earlier, then up at Lenora Vale's house beyond the ridge, and for the first time I understood why she had been so interested in getting rid of my cabin. I did not confront Lenora that day, even though every stubborn part of me wanted to walk straight up that hill, knock on her front door, and ask why 11 houses were sitting where my great-grandfather had once cut firewood. Instead, Owen told me to keep my mouth shut, which is advice I have never enjoyed receiving and almost always benefit from. He came back the next morning with his daughter, Mara Pike, a licensed surveyor in her own right, 34 years old, lean as a whip, and capable of hiking uphill through wet slash while carrying 40 pounds of equipment without appearing to breathe hard. The three of us walked the northern line for 9 hours. We found 10 additional stone markers, 2 rusted iron pins, and an old cedar post buried inside the trunk of a maple that had grown around it. Every marker matched the original 1901 deed. Every measurement placed the legal boundary more than 200 feet north of the HOA fence. By late afternoon, Owen had enough data to prepare a corrective survey, but before he packed his equipment, he stood over the map on our kitchen table and said, "Elias, once this is recorded, those homeowners do not magically become criminals, but their titles become defective overnight. Banks get nervous, insurers get louder, and people who thought they owned their backyard start hiring attorneys. You need somebody who understands title law before you do anything else." June slid a plate of sandwiches between us and said, "I know somebody." That somebody was Meredith Shaw, a Bangor attorney who had spent 17 years handling land disputes before moving into white-collar litigation. I had met her once during a timber easement case in 2012, and I remembered 2 things about her. She never wasted a word, and she made opposing counsel look like he had arrived at court without his shoes. Meredith listened to our story over the phone, asked for the deed, the development plat, the 2004 closing documents, and Owen's preliminary field notes, then told me not to contact Lenora, Everdy, the HOA board, or any affected homeowner until she understood what had happened. "How long will that take?" I asked. 90 days, she said, maybe less. And what am I supposed to do while they keep filing complaints? Document everything, smile when necessary, and give them enough rope to demonstrate intent. June looked at me across the kitchen table and mouthed, "You are terrible at smiling when necessary." She was right about that, too. Lenora filed another complaint 3 days later, this one claiming our stacked firewood attracted rodents and created a health hazard for the neighborhood. The nearest HOA house was more than 300 yards from the woodshed. but apparently Maine mice had become organized commuters. Daryl dismissed it before lunch. The following week, Lenore reported that June had threatened her in the frozen foods aisle of the grocery store. June had been in the pharmacy at the time, picking up blood pressure medication, which felt almost poetic. She began keeping every complaint in a blue accordion folder labeled Lenora, because, as she put it, some disasters deserve their own office supplies. Then Lenora came to the cabin in person. She arrived in a pearl-white SUV with 2 board members, a narrow-faced woman named Celeste Brannigan, and a retired bank manager named Russell Givens. Lenora wore a rust-colored wool coat, heeled boots that had no business on a gravel road, and the expression of somebody arriving to collect rent from people she considered temporary. I was splitting kindling beside the porch. June was inside, close enough to hear but far enough away to let me make my own mistakes. "Mr. Mercer," Lenora said, "the board has identified several violations along the community boundary, including unauthorized brush removal and possible encroachment by your sauna. I rested the axe against the chopping block. My sauna is 1 of 14 feet inside my recorded parcel." She raised her clipboard. "According to our maps, it is 20 feet from HOA-maintained land." "Then your maps are wrong." Russell shifted his weight. Celeste studied the trees. Lenora gave me a patient little smile that made my shoulders tighten. "We have maintained that boundary for 13 years. Mr. Mercer. We know where it is." I looked past her toward the ridge. "No," I said. "You know where your fence is. That is not the same thing." Her smile disappeared. She informed me that the HOA had authorized a boundary maintenance crew to clear brush the next morning, including any vegetation extending across what she called the community line. I told her plainly not to step onto my land. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You moved here recently, Mr. Mercer. Cedar Hollow Ridge has operated peacefully for over a decade. It would be unfortunate if your attachment to an obsolete cabin created unnecessary conflict for everyone." There it was. Not quite a threat. Not quite an offer, but enough truth slipped between the words to show me what she wanted. The cabin was proof of continuous family possession. As long as I lived there, walked the land, paid the taxes, and knew the history, the old boundary could never be quietly forgotten. I told her to leave. She stood there for several seconds, then turned and walked back to the SUV. June came out after they drove away, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She looked at the tire tracks, then at me. "Where do you want the camera?" We set up before sunrise. June positioned herself behind a hemlock halfway up the slope with a tripod, a long lens, a thermos, and the calm concentration she used to bring into a classroom before handling concentrated acid. At 9:16, Lenora arrived with Celeste, Russell, a landscaping contractor, and the teenage volunteer carrying a chainsaw that looked heavier than he was. Lenora pointed to the HOA fence and ordered the crew to begin cutting south of it. They worked for 94 minutes on my land. They cleared young spruce, cut alder, removed survey ribbon Owen had deliberately left near the line, and widened an old game trail into something resembling a maintenance corridor. I watched from the cabin to my grandfather's field glasses while June filmed every second in high definition with timestamps and GPS coordinates. I felt anger building in me, hot and immediate, but beneath it was something colder. Lenora was not confused. She had been warned. She was creating evidence because she still believed her position protected her. When the crew left, I called Meredith. She asked 3 questions. "Did they cross the line?" "Yes." "Did you warn them?" "Yes." "Do you have clear video?" "June has enough footage to release a documentary." Meredith paused, then said, "Good. Do nothing." Another month passed before she called us into her Bangor office. The room had gray walls, 2 metal filing cabinets, and a view of a parking garage, which seemed appropriate for a conversation that was about to make the forest feel dangerous. Meredith placed a thin, yellowed memo on the table. It had come from North Star Title and Escrow under subpoena. The memo was dated 1986 and written by Everett Vale's father, who had handled an earlier tax title review of the Mercer homestead. It stated that a 1975 survey had relied on a utility monument instead of the original SM 1901 witness stone, shifting the northern line south by approximately 225 feet. The last sentence read, "Corrective action recommended upon next transfer. Notice to Mercer heirs deferred pending management review." I read that sentence 3 times. My father had sold the northern parcel in 2004. Everett had handled the closing. The memo had been in his company file for 18 years. He knew the line was wrong. Meredith said. He issued the title policy anyway. Then she placed another folder beside it. The HOA had collected $300 per year from 52 households for boundary maintenance since 2011. More than $200,000 have been paid to a company called Availland Care LLC. Everett was the sole owner. Lenora was not trying to protect property values. She was protecting a revenue stream, a title fraud, and 11 defective home sites that could destroy her husband's company if anyone looked closely enough. I sat there without speaking. I thought about my father signing the 2004 papers while my mother was sick, trusting a local title agent because people in small towns are taught that a familiar name is the same thing as an honest one. Meredith folded her hands. "We are ready to file the corrective survey," she said. "Once it is recorded, I will notify the State Insurance Bureau and the Attorney General. I will also contact the affected homeowners before Lenora has time to turn them against you. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at June. She nodded once. "File it," I said. The survey was recorded on a Monday morning in November. By Wednesday, 3 title companies had frozen transactions inside Cedar Hollow Ridge. By Friday, 11 homeowners had received polite letters explaining that portions of their yards, septic systems, retaining walls, and in 2 cases their actual houses were located on land legally belonging to me. 10 of them called within 48 hours. They were frightened, confused, and angry, but most of that anger was aimed uphill. The 11th homeowner was Lenora Vale. She did not call. Instead, she hired her own surveyor, a respected man named Calvin Sutter, and paid him $5,000 from HOA funds to disprove Owen's work. Calvin walked the line in early December, found the SM91 stone in less than 20 minutes, and called Owen from the grocery store parking lot. "Your survey is clean," he said. "Their fence is 226 feet over." Then he called Lenora. Whatever he told her shattered the last piece of restraint she had. That evening, she posted in the neighborhood group that I had carved a fake boundary stone to extort innocent families. 2 days later, she announced an emergency community action to remove what she called fraudulent survey debris from HOA land. June read the post aloud at the kitchen table. I called Meredith, Daryl, and Owen. By Friday night, Owen had placed 2 trail cameras on the witness stone. Daryl had arranged for a sheriff's deputy to wait nearby, and June had carried her tripod back behind the hemlock. Saturday morning came cold and bright, with 6 inches of snow under the spruce. At 10:04, Lenora appeared to the trees wearing a blue parka and white snow pants. Celeste carried a shovel. Russell carried a battery-powered grinder. Lenora carried a sledgehammer. She stopped in front of the stone my great-grandfather had marked in 1901, lifted the hammer over her shoulder, and swung. The hammer hit the granite with a flat metallic crack that rolled through the trees like a rifle shot. Lenora stumbled backward, more surprised than hurt, while the stone sat exactly where Silas Mercer had placed it in 1901. She swung again, this time harder, and chipped the lower edge of the M. Russell stepped forward with the grinder. Celeste began digging through the frozen soil, and for the next 20 minutes the 3 of them worked like people trying to erase history before history had time to testify. They did not know the trail cameras were recording from 2 angles. They did not know June was filming from behind the hemlock, and they did not know Deputy Nora Bell was waiting 4 miles away with her engine running. I called her after the grinder cut into the inscription. She arrived 11 minutes later, walked down through the snow, and found Lenora standing over the stone with the sledgehammer in both hands. Deputy Bell looked at the damaged marker, then at Lenora. "Ma'am, put the hammer down." Lenora laughed once, sharp and breathless. "This is HOA property." Deputy Bell glanced at the survey flag beside the stone. "No, ma'am. According to the recorded corrective survey, it is not." Lenora tried to argue that the stone was fake, that I had planted it, that Owen was corrupt, that Meredith had manipulated the county, and that the entire state of Maine had somehow joined a conspiracy against Cedar Hollow Ridge. Deputy Bell let her finish, then placed her under arrest for criminal mischief, trespass, conspiracy, and destruction of a recorded survey monument. Russell and Celeste were arrested too. Lenora kept talking all the way to the cruiser, promising lawsuits against me, the sheriff, the county, the surveyors, and what she called the forestry establishment. June came down from the hemlock after the cars left. Snow clung to the knees of her gray pants and her fingers were stiff from holding the camera. But her face was calm. She handed me the memory card and said, "I believe that qualifies as enough rope." That night, after Owen reviewed the footage and Meredith confirmed the charges, June placed the phone on the kitchen table between us. "Call Luke," she said. Luke was our only son, 35 years old, a wildland firefighter in Idaho, and he had not been home in nearly 5 years. We had stopped speaking after I criticized him for leaving the state forestry job I had helped him get. I told myself I had been protecting his future. What I had actually done was confuse love with control. I called him, and when he answered, his voice was guarded. "Dad, is Mom okay?" "She is fine," I said. "We are both fine." I told him what had happened. Then I told him something I should have said years earlier. "I was wrong about your life. I was wrong to act like the road that worked for me had to work for you." There was a long silence. Then Luke said, "I can come home tomorrow." He arrived Sunday afternoon in a rented pickup, carrying one duffel bag and a box of pastries from Bangor. June reached him first and held him in the driveway so long that I finally looked away. When Luke came to me, neither of us knew what to do, so we shook hands, which lasted about 2 seconds before he pulled me into a hug. 5 years did not disappear in that moment, but the distance between us finally stopped growing. The story broke locally on Monday. By Wednesday, reporters from Bangor were calling Meredith. By Friday, the State Insurance Bureau had suspended Everett Vale's title license, and federal investigators had opened a case involving mail fraud, insurance fraud, and falsified closing disclosures. The old 1986 memo was impossible to explain away. Everett had known the survey was wrong when my father signed the 2004 sale, and he had insured the false boundary anyway. Investigators also traced more than $200,000 in HOA maintenance payments into Vale Land Care, where a good portion had been used for personal vehicles, vacations, and renovations to Lenora's house. The 11 affected homeowners were not charged with anything. They were victims, and I wanted them treated that way. We held a meeting in the back room of a volunteer fire station 2 weeks before Christmas. Owen brought maps. Meredith brought deed documents. Beryl came as a neutral county representative, and June brought 4 pies because she believed no land dispute had ever been made worse by apple filling. I offered each family the same resolution. They could purchase the encroached land at a reduced appraised value, lease it long-term, or challenge the survey in court. All 11 chose to purchase. I also directed $50,000 from the proceeds into a restitution fund for every household that had paid the fraudulent boundary fee. A retired nurse named Marjorie Hale cried when she signed. A former board member named Dennis Crowley stood in front of me and admitted he had supported Lenore because she always sounded certain. I told him certainty was cheap and survey work was not. He laughed, then apologized. Lenora did not attend. By spring, she had pleaded guilty to felony destruction of a survey monument, trespass, and conspiracy. She served 11 months in county custody and lost the HOA presidency she had treated like a hereditary title. Everett had pleaded guilty in federal court and received 2008 months. Northstar title in escrow was dissolved. His license was permanently revoked, and the remaining assets of Vale Land Care were distributed to Cedar Hollow Ridge residents. The new HOA elected Marjorie president and removed the boundary fee from its bylaws. She has been in office for 9 months and has not once complained about anyone's firewood. The damaged witness stone was restored by a stone mason from Augusta and reset into the bedrock. A brass cap was installed beside the original carving, along with a small plaque that reads, "A line forgotten is still aligned." June and I used part of the land sale proceeds to create a nonprofit survey fund for rural families who cannot afford professional boundary work. Owen came out of retirement to help run it, though he insists he was never properly retired because June kept feeding him. Luke stayed in Maine through the summer and took a temporary wildfire coordination position with the state. He has not promised to remain permanently, and I have not asked. Some lessons arrive late, but they still count if you are humble enough to use them. The cabin is still standing above Alder Run. The original cedar logs exactly where my grandfather placed them. In some evenings, Luke sits with us on the porch while the light turns copper between the spruce. I think about Lenora watching from her deck that first morning, smiling because she believed the complaint could push an old man off his land. In a way, she was right about one thing. The complaint changed everything. It exposed a stolen boundary, a fraudulent title company, a corrupt HOA fund, and a father who had spent 5 years defending his pride instead of calling his son. So tell me honestly, did I do the right thing by selling the land back cheaply to the homeowners? Or should I have forced every one of them off property my family had owned since 1901? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA that confused authority with ownership, share your story. Because sometimes the smallest marker in the woods is the only thing standing between your home and somebody else's lie.